Greetings, everybody. Welcome back to Apisecure. Next, we have Parth Shukla joining us, who is a security analyst at Cequence Security, and we'll be digging into attacking and mitigating vulns in GraphQL. Welcome, Parth. Take it away.
Hello everyone. So my name is Parth Shukla and I'm working with Cequence Security as a security analyst. So this talk is going to be about what is the dark side of GraphQL, what are the common vulnerabilities that you can find, and how do you mitigate them. So we'll go step by step along with the live POCs, which I have found across many websites. So you get to know the real idea behind how the vulnerability looks, what is a normal transaction, or what is the attacking transaction, or how you can identify, okay, this vulnerability is there and you can exploit it. So you might know that many companies are moving to GraphQL now just because it's quite efficient. There are less API calls to be made, and there's a better flexibility and facilitates collaboration as well. So GraphQL is really, really nice than REST API. And along this, like when I show you the PPT, there are jokes and tips that I've kept just to keep the flow entertaining. So make sure you read that. Yes. Okay. So how is GraphQL different from REST? You can see there are two parts here, REST API and GraphQL API. So in REST API, if you want to hit /player, /team, or /matches, you have to do it individually. So every time you make a call, there is an API transaction taking place. Where in GraphQL API, you get all the results in one call, and then you can select that what you want to show. So you'll just make a one call to the server, you'll get all the results, and with the help of queries, which we'll be discussing further, you can take whatever you want. You want to show players, show players. You want to show mixture of players and matches, players and teams, teams and matches. You can do anything you want. That's why we say here that it's an increased efficiency and better flexibility. So coming to what are GraphQL endpoints. So these are the common endpoints. There are plethora of endpoints out there. You can find the list here. I don't know if Apisecure is going to share PPT or not. If not, you can reach me out or Cequence Security, and we'll be sharing this PPT with you, in which you can find all the list of common API endpoint. Now it's not possible for human to hit the endpoint every time. Like if there are 60 endpoints, you don't know what endpoint might work. So for that, there's a tip here that I would use FFUF, which is a fuzzing tool in Go language, and which is an open source, of course. So you can create a GraphQL endpoint list and throw that to FFUF just to identify and make sure you use matcher as 200, which is a OK status code. So you know that, okay, you have got API endpoint, GraphQL API endpoint. This is the most important part of this presentation, which says that different type of queries in GraphQL. GraphQL does not have the regular queries like REST API, that is get, put, delete, post, etc. In GraphQL, we have three type of APIs in total, which is query, mutation, and subscription. So query is basically analogous to the get request in REST API. So if you want to get something from the server, you use queries. Mutations are the analogous to post, put, and delete requests. So if you want to change any data on GraphQL server, you need to use mutation query. We'll be discussing an authentication bypass flaw with the help of this mutation query, and subscription are the real-time updates. So if you send the API, if you send the subscription request, you will get to know that, okay, what is happening in real time in the server. Okay. So let's come to the main and most interesting part, that is attacker's perspective to GraphQL. Okay, so GraphQL is comparatively new to REST API. Whole world is on REST API since so many years. And now GraphQL has come into the picture, which has induced many vulnerabilities in the system. The introspection. This is the most easiest vulnerability and it has the impact as well. Okay, so GraphQL introspection allows us to get the underlying data of this server. So what is the backend data really looks like, how each data is connected to each other. Is there any way with the help of an ID I can get an address, I can get an email address, I can get an employee name? Or if I know the ID, with the help of ID can I get name, with the name I can get maybe account number, account type, and anything. That really depends on the company, that what the underlying data is. Okay, so there is a specific graph introspection query that we run to get the underlying data. It's here, and on the right side of the black, in the black screen, you can see not the whole query, but half of the query. That how does the query really look like? We'll see the live thing, that how the introspection helps us to get the correct data, correct underlying data. So introspection can reveal sensitive information about the application's underlying data model. I'll discuss one of the major scenarios that I came across when I was doing threat research. So this is the actual GraphQL introspection query endpoint that we can hit. I have uh, I have hidden the host and the refer origin because of the disclosure permissions. But you can see that there is this on the left hand side, there's a query, and on right hand side, we have the data, which is 8,51,000 bytes. So it's not possible for a human brain to detect or read the whole data and figure out that how the data are connected to each other. So for that, we have GraphQL Voyager. What is GraphQL Voyager? Now, Voyager helps us to make the graphical representation of the introspection query. It helps us to identify that, okay, what are the data, what is the schema, and how they are connected to each other. Okay. Now, this schema is an example schema. It is not for this because it won't be ethical if I show the company's underlying data schema. So you can see there is a film option in root, then film is connected to producer, then producer is connected to the plane connection, and plane connection is connected to passengers. And yeah, so you can figure out that how the data is connected. And this really help us to identify that what are the hidden calls in the API server. It might be possible that all the calls are not being made by the server because you are not allowed to do that. But with the help of introspection, you can figure out, okay, public access is not available to the plane connection or the vehicle connection, but you know there is a API out there. You can hit the endpoint. So you'll go to the burp, you'll go to burp suite, turn on the repeater, and try hitting all the data connected. Right. So it helps us to identify that, okay, these are the visible API, these are the hidden APIs, and this is how the data is connected. So that is why I say that introspection is a vulnerability in itself if it is exposed on a public facing API. Okay. Now there are many APIs in your company which are public facing. So it is not possible for you to go to each website and figure out that, okay, is there an introspection vulnerability here or not? Okay. So for that, we have come up with a solution where once we figure out that, okay, these are your uh, public APIs, we will help you to figure out that is that an introspection vulnerability or not. If it is there, you can see a pop-up here, introspection vulnerability. You'll see the request and you'll see the response. We are also planning to give you the graphical view in this product itself. So it will help you to figure out, okay, if the underlying data is correct or not, if it is revealing any sensitive data which should not be in public. So I hope it is clear that why introspection is a vulnerability when it is in public facing API. I'll give you a proper example. So I was doing bug bounty hunting on one of the supermarket in Amsterdam, which were running on GraphQL. So I was able to get the whole introspection query and underlying data. From there, I was able to grab the customer's email address, phone number, and their cart value, and also the mutation were enabled. We saw in queries that, okay, mutations are something in which you can change the data, like push, put, post, delete, request. Okay, so I was able to change the pricing of each product, and I could also delete the product. So I gave them POC and I was awarded with 4-digit bounty in that because that was very impactful. You could get customers cart value, customers information, anything you want. So for this, we need to make sure that all the calls are being authenticated and none of the calls are open to public. Okay. Now the second vulnerability is a batching. Batching is an it's not a vulnerability, it's a feature, but hackers are trying to exploit it with the help of DOS attack and authentication bypass. Earlier I told you that with the help of mutation we'll be figuring out that okay, how can we do authentication bypass. We'll be seeing the slides here that how authentication bypass is possible because of batching vulnerability. At the end of this presentation, I would be sharing all the mitigations that you have to do to protect batching or directive overloading or introspection query vulnerability and other vulnerabilities which you can uh, block. So batching is actually the calling out multiple queries in a single request. Okay. So you can see on the right hand side in the request body, I have two queries which are running simultaneously. Okay, in which I'm trying out the batching, and here I get two errors because nothing like batching or query trying batching exists in the database. Now it doesn't matter if I'm here to exploit batching, it doesn't matter if it is present or not. Okay, sometimes you'll see that in the error you will find a suggestive input which would say like field query does not exist, did you mean anything, question mark, which is a vulnerability in itself because you are trying to be suggestive, you are giving over information to the attacker that okay, trying batching does not exist, but does this exist. Okay, so with the help of this, attacker can figure out that what are the schemas available and how to go through data. Now just imagine you have that vulnerability along with the introspection vulnerability, so it's really easy to figure out how to move to data, how to make an hidden API calls. Okay, now how the batching is vulnerability. Okay, you can see the execution time here is 538 milliseconds with two queries in it. Okay, now as soon as I put many queries, you can see the execution time has increased from 538 milliseconds to 2000 milliseconds, which is 2 milliseconds. So, 2 seconds, sorry. So, the more number of queries I put, the more time it would take for server to respond to my request. And I'll keep doing this again and again and again and again, and eventually the server would exhaust all its resources, and you might get 529, which is an internal server error, or you will get your output really, really slow, which suggests that there is a DOS attack happening, and um, there is no limit to the depth of the query. Okay, you can run the depth, and like the depth value could be anything. You can put any number of requests you want, and the server would respond correctly. So the more number of requests, the limit would increase. Yeah, the what you can say, the time execution would increase. But nevertheless, if even if there is a query limitation, if suppose you can say the 1124 line is there, 1125 it would give me error that query depth limit reached, but I know that till 1124 I can make the request. So what I'll do is I'll go to my intruder would help me out to perform the request 100 times in 10 seconds. So I would perform this request, which I know that 1124 depth is allowed. So I would perform that number of requests 100 times, which would eventually slow the server down. So two basic things to figure this out is first, the depth query should be limited, and the second, rate limit should be in place. With the help of two simple mechanism, you can mitigate the batching request. How do we bypass the authentication with the help of batching? So this would majorly work where we have a multi-factor authentication in place. Many companies have that now, right? It's like obvious thing that if you want to secure your customer, you should have a 2FA in place. The mutations. While you put down your code and if you intercept in burp, it's pretty obvious that that is a post or a put request in REST. Similarly, analogous, we have mutations in GraphQL. So what it is really happening is, you can see I have three here, first, second, and third, and I have three inputs. Now variables are something in which you will put out your OTP code. Now if there is a batching vulnerability, then I could put out as many OTPs I want. That could be 1000 OTPs, 2000 OTPs, even 9999 OTPs. Okay, the limit doesn't count. So that is why batching should be resolved. Now, if any one of the 1000 OTPs I put is correct, I would get the correct response. Doesn't matter if other 999 are wrong. If I have the one correct OTP, I would still get the proper response. That is why batching and the mutation query enabled is really dangerous. You could easily bypass the 2FA functionality. So there is a tip here that BatchQL by SNode is a tool which will help you to figure out if there is a what you can say batching vulnerability or not. But that again, you need to do it on every single public API that you know. So we have come up with a solution again with this, which I would be showing when I show you the directive overloading vulnerability, which is the next one. Directive overloading and batching is quite similar. The main point is in batching, you are putting out different requests. Here you can see there are multiple requests or the arrays of requests. Inside an array, there are 1000 requests separated by comma. Okay. Now, when we come to directive overloading, okay, first I'll explain what is directive, what are runtime directive. So a runtime directive are just like loops in a script we write. Okay, we know that for I is equal to something or if is equal to something, if the value is true, it will go inside the if loop. Similarly, with the runtime directives, we have two major runtime directives in GraphQL, which is skip and include. So skip is like if the name is XYZ, then skip the whole iteration or whole algorithm. And include is if the value is true, it will include the whole algorithm. Okay. Now, runtime directives are not often what we can say exploited by attackers because everyone is focusing on batching, which is really easy to exploit. And directives, we know that there are two major directives and people are not really sure that okay, what do we do with directives, how do we mitigate them. Okay, so directive are exploited the same way we exploit batching, but in this case we don't have multiple requests in runtime directive. What we have is multiple runtime directives in a single request. Okay, that's the difference between batching and exploiting runtime directive. So you can see the execution time here is 412 milliseconds. Now the tip here is multiple error confirms that the server is vulnerable to directive overloading. So if I put twice I put at the rate AA. So at the rate is a symbol to recognize if it is a directive or not. So if I put AA and if I get two errors, then it means that, okay, server is really executing that the number of directives I give. And it says that, okay, AA is not the directive or can we use one at this location. Okay. So we come to this, we are now figuring out as well that, okay, if there is a directive overloading vulnerability in your system or not in all of your public facing API. So this is a normal transaction that we do. And you can see the execution time is 412 millisecond. And this is the attack transaction. In attack transaction, we give out multiple runtime directives because we know the more directives we give, the execution time would increase if the vulnerability is that, just like the batching vulnerability. Correct. So yeah, that's the case. You can see here the again time has been increased to 24321 milliseconds. Okay, so what are the possible mitigation of all these vulnerabilities? Okay, So first of all is implementing the depth limit for incoming GraphQL queries. What is depth limiting? So here, when you see, let me just give you the example, which in that case it will be much more clear. Okay, here you can see we have two queries here, and here inside the query we have batching, and again in batching we have query. Now, how do you know this? Once you have the docs, or if you have the introspection vulnerability, you know what schemas to call and how to call them. If not, you can just give this and figure out if there is a vulnerability or not. But depth limiting is how many queries you can call inside a request. That should be limited. Okay, if your maximum query in your system that you have written is around 100 or 200, you should not allow 300 limit to the depth query. Okay, that would really be bad thing for your server, because if attacker tries to call 300 requests inside of one query, then it would increase the time execution for that query. Okay, perform query cost analysis to limit expensive query. So expensive query is like, again, it comes to the depth limiting, that okay, one query is taking 2 seconds for inside a server to respond, and if an attacker is calling 10 of those queries consecutively within 5 seconds or 10 seconds, then the expense to the server would be increased, not as a monetary expense, but as the time expense. Okay, so query cost analysis is really important. Enforcing rate limit. So the best mitigation to GraphQL would be enforcing rate limit along with depth limiting. Okay, so rate limit would help you to figure out that okay, attacker is not having DOS attack, or is not doing DOS attack because we are accepting the request n number of times coming from a single IP or any IP rotation or something, correct? So you need to enforce a rate limit to figure out that how to block this type of vulnerabilities. Now, disabling introspection queries in public APIs. Disabling introspection is really important because, as we discussed, that underlying API or underlying backend structure can reveal many sensitive data in your system. Okay, it's not possible for any developer to just go and figure out okay, if this API is leaking out introspection or not. So for that case, we have a tool quite ready that you can use, and which will help you to figure out that okay, if it is a public API, is your API vulnerable to introspection vulnerability? Can attacker get underlying database or underlying schema, that how each data in your server is connected? Using a whitelist for allowed characters. This mitigation will help you out with the injection attacks. GraphQL is vulnerable to command injection, SQL injections, and any kind of even XSS injections as well. Now just imagine if you have the XSS injection along with the mutation query that you have enabled for public use, then I could just put out the XSS payload. And if your page is vulnerable, it could be impactful stored XSS vulnerability, right? That I can change any customer name with the XSS payload, and every time he hits his profile, it's getting a pop-up, and he cannot use the profile unless you can change the name. Okay, so end user might not know, might not be very technical with changing out the username with the help of burp suite and throwing out mutation query. That's not you expect when you are serving customers, right? So be sure that you are using whitelist for allowed character, and add pagination to limit the amount of information that can be accessed by a single request. So pagination is, you limit the information that you give in your response. You don't need to show every information to the server. The abstraction is the winning thing, right? So you need to be abstract, and you need to show the limited amount of information that you really want your customers to know. Okay, so how does this help? So discovery. So first, when you use the product for the GraphQL, what we'll do is we will discover all the public facing APIs. So once we have your TLD, we will discover all the public facing APIs you have. Then we will store that in our inventory to find out in future if there is an attack or not. Compliance is something just like the introspection vulnerability, that okay, your underlying database is not being accessed by attacker or hacker in an, what you can say, bad way, or he or she cannot access the underlying database from us, from a public facing API. Detection: we can detect the attack as they happen or even before that, because once we have the public facing API, we will be sending out all the requests that we have and detect if there is a vulnerability or not. It can be a batching vulnerability or a deductive overloading or introspection vulnerability or injection vulnerability, anything. Okay, so we can help you to detect if there is a actual vulnerability present or not. Prevention will give you out the actual prevention, that okay, if there is a batching vulnerability, how you can actually prevent that, by doing a depth limit or a rate limit kind of thing, or whitelisting if there is injection attack, or not allowing multiple directives in an query to protect the, what we can say, overloading directive vulnerability. Okay, then again, once we do the prevention, it will go to the testing and figure out if the vulnerability is present or not. Now testing is really important because there might be a case where you can bypass the current mitigation and you can get uh, the attacker can get the result he or she wants, just like the DOS attack. Okay, so that every time testing occurs, we will enter all the new or bypassed mitigations, which will help you to figure out, okay, if the attack is happening again, that will again go to detection, then prevention, then testing. And if you have any public facing API which you are launching, then again that will go to discovery, or you have already launched, we will keep crawling the data, and once we find out that okay, there is a new API, it will go again through whole the protection life cycle of for the GraphQL thing. So that's everything. That were three main attacks that I wanted to discuss along with the mitigation. And yeah, thank you so much. And yes, Cequence do provide security assessment for your company at no cost. So feel free to scan QR code and register for the free security assessment. Along with that, once if you want PPT, I believe Apisecure would help you out with the PPTs. But if not, feel free to message me on parth.shukla@sequence.ai or 0xparth on Twitter. And I have already entered all the data you want the introspection query. If you want, you can just click on the introspection query to get the query. Just put out on your repeater or GraphQL console, whatever you're using, and in that way you will be able to figure out if there is a GraphQL vulnerability there or not. The same way, the batching as well. There is a payload out here. Even for the directive overloading, there is a payload out here as well. So feel free to check all the vulnerabilities in your system if you have a GraphQL endpoint. If you have a GraphQL endpoint, if your GraphQL endpoint public facing or not, don't forget to scan your top level domain on Shodan as well, because I have seen that from my personal experience. You can get many GraphQL endpoints which are open to public from Shodan, which you might never know that okay, it's open to public or not. And also you have the Cequence security API spider product, which will help you to do everything, I guess. Yeah, so from all the protection life cycle, we can do everything you want. So yep, that's it. Thank you so much for joining in, and I hope this talk was productive.
Thank you so much, Parth, for all that detailed information. You mentioned that you had found some vulns via bug bounty. Do you see these often out in the wild?
Yes, there are, because companies are really new to GraphQL. Even GraphQL is new to public. So it's really important that we protect all the vulnerabilities, and introspection, batching, directive overloading, injection attacks are there in wild. It's just that you need to know if the company is having public facing GraphQL server or not.
In particular, are you finding that particular industries are adopting GraphQL?
I believe most of the industries related to banking and healthcare are moving to GraphQL because they have the recursive call for transaction or getting a patient ID or something. So it's the query cost to in REST API is way more than we have in GraphQL. So tech and this both things are really moving to GraphQL.
Okay, somebody mentioned fintech.
Yeah.
And then are you finding that a lot of developers are actually, switching to learning this, to really learning the security behind GraphQL?
Yes, companies are moving to GraphQL because it's really efficient for them, even cost efficient to them, because they do not have to make the call every time they want. They can just put out one call and they'll get all the data, and then from all the data they can show the specific data they want. So it's really cost efficient for them as well.
And for people to get into this, how did you get into GraphQL?
So I was on the Facebook bug bounty program where I knew that okay, Facebook has something called as GraphQL. So it was GraphQL was developed by Facebook. So I was really interested on how GraphQL is working and how are people finding vulnerabilities in that. So I kept reading about GraphQL, and recently there was a book on the Black Hat GraphQL. So that is also amazing book. I think the author is also speaking here. So yeah, that book is really amazing. Yeah, so that is the way I got into GraphQL. Thanks to Facebook, though. Yeah.
Facebook did something right, I guess.
So yeah,
Any
so
other
that's
parting
a game.
words of wisdom? I love the puns, by the way. I have to give you credit for those. Those were definitely entertaining. Thank you for
Thank you.
sharing
Thank
those.
you.
Did you come up with those on your own?
Some of them were from ChatGPT, to be honest. That's the best thing in this world, maybe.
No, definitely added a nice element to the presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Any parting words of wisdom? Any final questions that we can pop up from the chat?
Yeah, if there is any question, feel free to ask or feel free to reach me out on my Twitter 0xparth or Instagram 0xparth, or you can drop a message on www.parthshukla.com or sequence.ai. Anything is good. We'll
Awesome.
respond to you ASAP.
And
Yeah,
somebody in the chat just shared the link to the book. So thank you, Christoph.
yeah, thanks. Awesome.